In this presentation, I will be describing ethical dog population management, DPM, by first introducing a basic ecological model for conceptualizing dog populations and arguing that if we try to understand this system, we can design an intervention that has the best chance of being effective by addressing the problem at source and then using a suite of humane tools that work together to manage the dog population for the benefit of both dogs and people. I would like to start by defining this term ethical in the contents of this presentation. I've taken it to have three main elements. Firstly, ethical DPM respects the sentience of animals, the capacity of dogs to suffer, and ensures that all activities that directly engage with dogs do so humanely. I also believe that ethical DPM engages the human community fully. The people that live with and amongst these dogs have a right and a responsibility to be involved in their management, and their consent and active support is essential for success. And finally, I believe that ethical DPM needs to strive to be efficacious and sustainable, and should be objectively monitored and adaptively managed to achieve this, in light of the fact that it usually uses either or both public or charitable funds. I am also conscious that there is great geographical variation in dog population dynamics, the problems they cause, and therefore the management that will be needed, but I do believe there are general concepts that we can all benefit from. Okay, so to start, here we have some examples of roaming dogs. I tend to use the term roaming dogs, but you could call them stray or street dogs. Importantly, my definition of a roaming dog is behavioural only. This is a dog roaming, moving around in a public space without the supervision of a person. I do not imply anything about the ownership status of the dog with that term. Now, we know that dogs can cause a number of problems in society. Dog bites, disease transmission, in particular rabies, road traffic accidents, defecation in public places and associated risk of parasite transmission, predation of livestock and wildlife, aggression towards pets, not just people, but also we hear from dog owners that it's sometimes challenging to walk their dogs in places where there are a lot of roaming dogs. And then this final issue of the look and feel of the streets. Now that may sound like a minor problem, but it is mentioned quite frequently, reflecting a perception that the sight of roaming dogs is no longer acceptable or fitting for the town or city in question. So really it's an issue of perception. And you can look at this issue through the lens of social capital. Social capital describes those things that count most in people's lives, such as goodwill, social bonds, social discourse, and feeling safe and feeling empowered to make changes for the good of the community. The walkability of streets is one aspect that can impact on one's social capital, and it describes how friendly the streets are to walking, whether they're places you avoid because they make you feel unsafe. And that's something that could be impacted upon by the presence of roaming dogs. But we also know that the dogs themselves can suffer. So you get suffering on the streets in terms of malnutrition and illness or injury, and suffering at the hands of inhumane control. In locations with roaming dogs, these dogs tend to figure highly in the list of complaints to local authorities, but it would be a mistake to think that these are only about the problems caused by dogs. Just as often, these complaints can reflect a concern for dog welfare, such as reports of litters of puppies that appear to have been dumped and are suffering in the streets, or complaints about cruel handling by ill-prepared animal control staff. And it's at this early stage of identifying these dogs as the potential cause of all these problems that the first potential mistaken and untested assumptions can be made. First of all, that these are all unowned dogs, that nobody cares about them. And second, that they are all born on the streets. Their parents were also roaming unowned dogs. And if you believe those two assumptions are true, you may come to the conclusion that if you could just remove all of the current roaming dog population, then the problem would be solved. Of course, this is not the case. Here we have a photo of dogs culled using strychnine in Nepal, a practice that was used for many thousands of dogs over every year for decades, with no seeming change in the rate of killing. So they had this constant cycle of killing and replacement. And then here we have a classic example of a drastically overfull shelter. So even when there's a system of collecting dogs from the streets alive, the problems can just manifest themselves in a new location. And of course, this is highly unethical based on the factors I listed at the outset. So we have significant suffering of sentient animals. Communities are horrified by such places and avoid them, and therefore nobody comes to rehome the dogs. And these places become highly ineffective because they're too full to take in any new dogs, and they're very expensive to run. So what's the alternative? The ICAM Coalition in particular have been promoting an ecological and evidence-based approach, starting with the question, what are the subpopulations of these roaming dogs? So don't consider them as one amorphous mass. And perhaps most importantly, where do each of these dogs come from? Now you can describe the subpopulations as states and their sources as processes, taking an ecological mindset, although the terms are not really that important. If you were describing this in terms of an economic system, you might use the term stocks and flow. What's important is that taking this approach allows you to start focusing your sights on the root cause of the problem, the actual source of these dogs, and not just the symptom of the current roaming dog population. So what are these different roaming dog states that we see? Well, first of all, we have these owned roaming dogs. So these are dogs that have a household, but for at least part of the day, the owners allow these dogs to roam freely without supervision. Then we can have a population of these dogs. These are owned lost dogs, hopefully temporarily lost, and that they then can be reunited with their owners, but they maybe end up being lost permanently and becoming part of either community-owned dog population or the unowned dog population. So here we have our community-owned dog population. They have no single owner, but several households within the community are providing limited care, usually food, sometimes water, sometimes shelter. And then over here, we have this unowned dog population that has no specific or regular care provided by anybody. Now, these are usually abandoned owned dogs. Feral dogs do exist, but they are rare. So ferals are normally described as those dogs that are quite unsocialised. They exist on resources not purposefully provided by people. So you may find them around slaughterhouses that are discarding offal or around dump sites. But their survival is usually poor and their breeding success even worse. And in many cases, their numbers are maintained by constant abandonment. Now, it's also important to note that a single dog may be all of these states within its lifetime. So it may start out as an owned dog that's allowed to roam and then be abandoned to become part of the unowned dog population. Through its ability to charm and through the kindness of the local community, it can find its way into this state of a community-owned dog. And if it's very lucky, it may then rejoin the owned dog population through a process of adoption. So if we go back and look at these dogs that I showed earlier, we can see that they describe some of these different states. So down here we have an owned roaming dog. Someone actually owns this dog. The person that lives in this house owns this dog, but he allows it to roam for at least part of the day. These two dogs are from Jaisalmer in India. They don't have a single owner, but several people in this community would feed them on a regular basis, and they were very friendly, charming dogs. And then up here we have this unowned dog population. On the top left here we have an abandoned owned dog in Puerto Rico, a pit bull type who is in a pretty poor state. And then this is a dog here that was in Panama City, presumably also an abandoned owned dog, because the survival of puppies on the streets in that city appeared to be quite poor, and he's also not in a good state of welfare. But beyond just these states, we need to start looking at the processes involved in how dogs move from one state to another. And when we do that, we need to start to widen our perspective beyond just the current roaming dog population. And that's where terms such as stray dog control can sometimes be misleading. It focuses us too tightly just on this population here. Better to consider the term dog population management and try to understand the whole dog population and the processes that are going on. And what your DPM intervention wants to do is to drive processes in a targeted way so that you can begin to change those different states. So let's go through these processes section by section. First of all, we have these processes related to owner behaviour. So up here we have the process of roaming and confinement. And confinement may mean not just physical confinement, but ensuring that the dog has sufficient resources within the household so they have no need to roam in order to access additional resources. We have a process down here of dogs becoming lost and hopefully then reunited, although potentially not. And then we have a couple of processes here. First of all, abandonment of owned dogs into the unowned population. And then this process of adoption, where people are adopting dogs into the household directly from the streets. And then we have this process of community engagement, and that describes providing regular care to a dog, mostly food, but sometimes water, shelter, sometimes even veterinary care. And that moves dogs from this unowned dog population into this community-owned dog population. Of course, that process can also go in the opposite direction. Communities can become disengaged, and therefore community-owned dogs will move back into this unowned dog population. And of course, we have a more positive process within community engagement. If people are really engaged with their street dog population, you may find that some of these are also adopted into the owned dog household. And then we have these processes relating to breeding success. First of all, birth, and then the process of recruitment, when puppies survive to adulthood and join the breeding population themselves. It's important to note that these processes will not be the same for every dog. They will depend very much on available resources, and some dog states will on average be more successful breeders than others. So of the roaming dog states, the owned roaming are likely to be the most successful breeders, as they can benefit from shelter and resources provided by their owners. Community dogs may have some success dependent on the reliability of those resources provided by the community, with unowned dogs likely to be the least successful breeders as they have few reliable resources or options for shelter. In some locations, there will be a system for collecting dogs from the streets and holding these for reuniting with owners in the case of lost dogs, or potentially for rehoming if no current owner can be found. Dogs may also enter this facility through the process of relinquishment directly from owners. Now, if systems are working well, the facility is well connected to the community, and the numbers of dogs are not excessive, adoption or reuniting will be the only processes for healthy dogs to exit the facility. Now, death is obviously a process relevant to all states. This may be because a dog dies of natural causes, or is euthanized because it's suffering from an incurable illness, injury, or an unmanageable behaviour problem. However, healthy dogs may also be euthanized, in which case this process is called culling, and this may happen after a period of time in holding facilities or rehoming centres, or may happen directly on the streets without a period of holding. The methods used should be humane, however inhumane culling is still an issue in many parts of the world. This occurs most often when culling is done directly on the streets, but it may also be the fate of dogs held temporarily in shelter facilities. We have so far looked mostly at the roaming dog population. However, we also need to widen our perspective to consider the sources of owned dogs, because different sources may have different risks of becoming part of the roaming population later on. For example, dogs purchased on impulse from a market, potentially with health issues and little socialisation, could be at higher risk of abandonment or relinquishment as their problems manifest themselves on an unprepared household. We have three broad sources of where people can get their next dog from in this particular model: from a litter born within a household, from a companion or working dog that may be sold or just given away; those born to people considering themselves to be breeders, so purposefully breeding for sale; and vendors such as pet shops and markets, usually stocked by breeders. Within each of these sources, there are also variations. For example, breeders can vary from Kennel Club registered pedigree dog breeders through to... But if we bring all this together, what we have is a perspective of how the whole dog population dynamics is functioning. By taking this perspective, we can begin to see what we know and what we don't know, and therefore focus our efforts on exploring those elements, those processes and states that appear either unknown or are particularly relevant as a source of roaming dogs, allowing us to design and target our interventions more accurately. However, before I talk about that stage of exploration and then design, I did want to pause to highlight that for nearly all of these processes, human behaviour is a core determinant. We are not dealing with urban wildlife here. This is a truly domestic species whose birth, survival and behaviour is highly influenced by what people do to them. So changing human behaviour will be an essential part of any DPM intervention. I'm not going to be able to cover this today, so just wanted to flag this book as one I found particularly useful in DPM. The Behaviour Change Wheel uses the COM-B model to understand behaviour. So that's looking at someone's capability, opportunity and motivation to perform behaviours. This book also then takes you from that first behavioural diagnosis stage of trying to understand why people do what they do, through to creating a targeted intervention designed to change behaviour sustainably. So just to emphasise that point, I think there's a real danger of seeing all of these dogs and considering this as solely a veterinary problem. And there is a significant veterinary challenge to be met. But we also need the professions of teachers, campaigners, marketing experts, social marketing experts, if we're going to alter how people behave with their dogs. Okay, so I've tried to justify the relevance of understanding dog population dynamics in order to design DPM interventions. But how do we access this understanding? It requires a combination of methods, and you will find many of these described more fully in ICAM's Are We Making a Difference guide, which is available on the website. So firstly, you can use already existing secondary sources of data, such as those data held by local authorities or hospitals, to explore those problems related to dogs, looking to see whether there are temporal or geographic patterns, or whether there are particular dogs intimated by the data. And also that allows you to look back at historical DPM efforts and evaluate those, not necessarily to be restricted by them, but to learn from them. There will be both successes and failures in what has happened before. And then you can start exploring the current dog population, using street surveys to establish roaming dog density, welfare and breeding through the presence of lactating females on the streets, as this guy in the top left is doing in Panama City. Also using household questionnaires, as these guys are doing in Puerto Rico. And that will allow you to establish owned dog demographics, the gender, age and sources of owned dogs, also to establish current care behaviours such as sterilisation, vaccination and roaming. But we also do need to go further in understanding why those caring behaviours do or do not exist. So you can use focus groups and semi-structured interviews with owners to understand why people do things like abandon their dog. This initial assessment also helps to establish baselines for important indicators like the density of roaming dogs. So I'd like to share with you this example of this exploration or initial assessment. This is from a municipality called Trebinje in Bosnia. So through a combination of street surveying and household questionnaires, we found that 35% of the households owned dogs, that about 20% of these owned dogs were allowed to roam for at least part of the day unsupervised. And we found that of these owned dogs, about 20% were sourced as pups of litters born within that same household. And we found that just 20% of the females were spayed. So we were able to conclude that in this particular municipality, there was limited spaying of female dogs and that the owned dogs were breeding successfully. We also asked people if they knew about any litters that had been born in their immediate neighbourhood in the last year. And of those people that did know of litters, 26% knew that at least one of the pups had been abandoned from those litters. So we knew that abandonment was a major source of roaming dogs. When we looked at the dogs on the streets, we found relatively few were lactating. In fact, there was just one female in particular, a well-known female from the community-owned dog population, who was lactating. There didn't appear to be breeding going on between the unowned dog population. We found that 8% of owned dogs had been adopted directly from the streets, but we found that just 1% had been adopted from the local shelter, which is a shame because the shelter had exceeded its capacity and there were many dogs there that were ideal candidates for adoption back into a household. So through that initial assessment, we were able to establish priority processes for the next stage of the DPM intervention to focus upon. In particular, making sterilisation services more accessible for owners so that unwanted breeding within the households could be brought under control. Also exploring ways of improving the accessibility and attractiveness of the shelter and its dogs to encourage adoption. And engaging in some more detailed assessments of why abandonment was occurring, not just of puppies but also of adult dogs, which appeared to be a likely source of the dogs we were observing on the streets. Now, I shouldn't oversell initial assessment. It will provide important evidence-based insights into dog population dynamics, but resources for initial assessment are usually limited, and so they're always remaining assumptions, unanswered questions, and that's okay, so as long as those assumptions are clearly recognised. Because what we need to do going forward is to monitor indicators as the intervention progresses and take the time to evaluate the data produced by that monitoring to see whether the intervention is working and whether those assumptions appear to be holding true, and then use that learning to adapt and improve the intervention. So we know that DPM is a permanent challenge. We sometimes talk of 3 or 5 year projects, but these must roll seamlessly into the next phase. Wherever we have people, we will have dogs, and some need to manage the population to minimise risks and maximise benefits. And it's this particular issue of monitoring and evaluation for what you could call adaptive management, improving your intervention, that a recent ICAM guidance addresses. So this Are We Making a Difference document is a practical guidance on monitoring and evaluation of dog population management interventions. So you can download the full PDF document from the ICAM website, or you can use the online tool on the same website, and it will ask you a series of questions about your dogs and about your intervention, and then we'll select the content that appears most suitable based on your answers, and we'll create a shorter PDF document for you. The audience was very much the DPM implementers, so the people in the field that are engaged in dog population management, but also donors to those interventions. And it was very focused in resource limited communities. So I hope now I've made the argument for understanding dog population dynamics through initial assessment to allow for enlightened intervention design, and also for making the commitment to monitor and evaluate progress. The question is, what should our intervention actually involve? Now, for this next section, I'm going to draw heavily on ICAM's Humane DPM document, but also on the OIE's Chapter 7.7 Stray Dog Population Guidance, which is part of their Terrestrial Animal Health Code. We have 6 main areas for tools in ethical DPM, and I'm going to go through each one of these in turn. This first area of intervention, education and behaviour change of owners and non-dog owners in the wider community. And here I've highlighted the many processes that can be influenced by such tools. Now this is such a large and creative field, so gone are the days of relying on only leaflets and puppets in classrooms for education. Not to say that those aren't useful, but they're probably not sufficient on their own. I've got a photo here that's actually from a cat project, and this is from a UK NGO called Cats Protection, and they ran a project in a deprived urban community in the UK, and they used a community art project to engage local people in decorating and importantly displaying wooden cat silhouettes all around the community. And images of these colourful cats were then combined with a social media campaign to motivate local people to want to sterilise their cat, and also to take advantage of local low-cost veterinary services before it was too late. So not after the first unwanted litter of kittens were born, but before. And then when we look at the education for professionals, perhaps more appropriately termed training or capacity building, we can see there are other processes we can impact upon. For example, helping improve veterinary services for spay and neuter, but also helping to ensure humane methods of euthanasia are available when needed. There are also several professionals involved in the collection and care of dogs within the shelter facilities, where training can improve care, handling, and therefore the welfare of the dogs involved, and improved shelter management and communication can also increase adoption. The tool of legislation will be targeting different people. Legislation of breeders and sellers impacts on these processes highlighted here. It should aim to encourage responsible breeding practices with dog welfare as a priority. Ideally, this also needs to be agile legislation to keep pace with changes in supply chains and consumer access. For example, consider how many dogs are bought online now compared to just 10 years ago. Legislation of owners addresses some of these processes. It should make cruel and neglectful behaviour, including abandonment, illegal. But there is also the opportunity to go further and encourage behaviours to ensure positive welfare, as done through the Code of Practice for the Welfare of Dogs in the UK. Now, the behaviours listed in that document are not intended to be legally binding, but rather they're practical guidance on how owners can comply with the Animal Welfare Act in the UK. But they also go further and suggest those behaviours that will contribute to their dog's well-being. Registration identification will be focused on these processes of reuniting lost dogs, either directly from the streets or probably more likely through holding facilities. Now, registration identification can, of course, become part of legislation. There's several details within legislation identification that need to be considered, not least is how accessible the database is to owners to be able to change and update their data on how to communicate with them. The tool of vet care, usually sterilisation or spay and neuter and vaccination, can be particularly impactful on these processes. The aim is to make these services more accessible to ensure unwanted litters can be avoided, but also to ensure that dogs are regularly vaccinated and treated for parasites to maintain health of both the dogs and the people around them. If possible, veterinary care should be paid for by owners, potentially at a subsidised rate, to ensure these services are valued and sustainable. Though this may not be immediately possible in all communities, arguably rabies vaccination in particular should be provided for free in most countries where dog rabies is endemic, because maintaining herd immunity against rabies is so important for the wider community. Where community dogs exist and are well tolerated by local people, catch, neuter and return, or CNR, can be used to target these processes. A CNR is the name for a tool where roaming dogs are captured for neutering and vaccination and then returned to their point of capture. Now, it focuses on these processes. However, there is the potential for owned roaming dogs being caught up and sterilised as well, with a risk of this being done without owner consent. Now, CNR may also impact on these processes of community engagement or disengagement with the care of street dogs, and with adoption versus abandonment of owned dogs. Now, how CNR intervention is run, its public messaging, will dictate how it will impact on these processes. So, for example, if you catch dogs early in where rehoming capacity exists, rehoming centres or foster systems can provide a system for moving dogs to new homes. They can also become a base from which other services such as low-cost veterinary care can be provided. For example, this is a photo of Footprints of Joy in Cernavodă, Romania, run by Save the Dogs and Other Animals, where they are about to open a new veterinary clinic on the same land as this shelter for servicing the local community with veterinary care. But they are expensive to run well, and if run poorly, can just cause as many problems as leaving the dogs on the streets. Again, they must be considered as just an optional tool for DPM and not as a complete solution. As is clear from this model, they do not address many of the processes which act as sources of roaming dogs, and so will be ineffective if used in isolation. And then we have this issue of euthanasia, or more accurately culling when we're talking about healthy dogs. Arguably the tool most likely to cause disagreement within DPM, for good reason as there are actual lives at stake. Note that I'm talking about the euthanasia within a shelter facility or system. I am not talking about culling dogs from the street as a tool within ethical DPM. Although there may be times when immediate euthanasia is needed for a dog that is seriously suffering in the street, there is no place for mass or indiscriminate culling of dogs on the street within ethical DPM. Okay, so we look more deeply now into euthanasia. These first 2 points are usually well accepted by most people. Firstly, that you should always use humane methods, and the OIE guidelines provide a list of those methods considered humane by the OIE. And then the second point is that you must always have the capacity to euthanize a dog that is suffering if your intervention plans to handle dogs directly. Now, this is a direct quote from the ICAM document. When running holding facilities and rehoming centres or networks, euthanasia will be required for animals that are suffering from an incurable illness, injury or behaviour problem that prevents them from being rehomed, or are not coping well enough with the facilities to maintain a reasonable level of welfare. Ultimately, a successful population management programme should create a situation where these are the only occasions when euthanasia is required and all healthy animals can be found a good home. Probably so far so good. But it's this third point where differences can occur. I am again quoting here from the ICAM guide, but I must emphasise I'm not speaking here for every member of the coalition. Each member has its own policy on euthanasia. In reality, however, most countries will not be able to achieve this situation immediately. That's a situation where only unhealthy dogs are euthanised. But we'll need to work towards it, accepting that some healthy animals will be euthanised as not enough homes exist that can provide a good level of welfare. Euthanasia deals with only the symptoms and not the causes of population problems. It will not lead to population management and must not be relied upon as the sole response. Most discussions around euthanasia or culling are dominated by the black and white. You must never kill a healthy animal, the right to life, versus clearing out the stray dog menace. The reality is usually within the shades of grey. I identify strongly with the ethic of never killing a healthy animal who gives us the right to take away a life because it does not suit our homes or our vision of the streets. And we should celebrate those countries that are already there and strive to get there ourselves. But I have also seen the horror of a no-kill ethic imposed upon a situation where the number of dogs far outstrips the resources to provide a good state of welfare. And I believe there are worse things than death. We also don't have the right. So what I have described here is this DPM pathway, starting with establishing the priority problems and therefore the objectives or the aims of the DPM intervention. Then using a process of initial assessment to expose or explore the states and processes within the dog population dynamics within that specific location. That allows you to clarify assumptions and any remaining questions. Then design the intervention based on the insights provided by that initial assessment. Then implement the intervention and monitor it as you go, giving yourself the time and headspace to evaluate the data produced through monitoring and then adaptively manage that intervention, constantly improving it to make it more effective. The question remains, who does this? Who drives this path? And the Humane Community Development Process, or HCD, identifies the opportunity to build consensus and momentum through a multi-stakeholder community group who then drives the DPM themselves, as opposed to outside charities or local authorities working in isolation. So I'd like now to describe two different examples of DPM. One is from the UK and the other is from Nepal. Quite different environments and therefore quite different intervention types to give you an idea of the variation of what's possible. So starting first with the UK. We know we have 9.3 million owned dogs in the UK. About a quarter of UK households own dogs. We don't have a community-owned dog population, but we do have dogs, roaming dogs collected from the streets each year. 81,000 dogs were collected from the streets in 2016, and that number has been steadily decreasing over the last 5 years. We have quite a large rehoming centre population. 250,000 dogs go through the many rehoming centre facilities in the UK each year. We know that 22% of owned dogs are adopted from rehoming centres, which is quite a good rate. However, relinquishment and collection, those processes currently exceed adoption and reuniting. And currently there is still healthy dogs euthanised in the UK. The numbers are estimated to be relatively low, just a few thousand, but anyone working in companion animal welfare in the UK will be cognizant of the need to get to zero, and thankfully those numbers do seem to be decreasing year on year. Now, we know that dogs in the UK are normally relinquished to rehoming centres as adults, not as puppies. We have a 71% sterilisation of owned dogs in the UK, and that percentage has been steadily increasing in recent years. So we don't have many unwanted litters. but we do have a significant issue with acquisition. So we do still have impulse buying, with 13% of owners purchasing a pup with no prior research at all. We have issues of poor socialisation and training, with 13% of owners doing no dog training, and we know that these are risk factors for later relinquishment. We have some quite unrealistic expectations on the part of our owners, and we have issues of poor or illegal breeding. And it's at this point that my basic diagram really becomes insufficient. We don't just have one population of breeders, we have several subpopulations within them. So everything from your kennel club registered pedigree breeders through to puppy mills, through to illegal import of puppies from elsewhere in Europe. So this process of purchase has been researched in much more detail than is suggested by my relatively simple model. And I'll go into some of the interventions that have been launched as a result of that more detailed research. I did also want to mention the PDSA Poor Report. PDSA is a charity in the UK who invest in research of pet owners every year, resulting in some excellent ongoing indicators of pet ownership behaviour. And also the Stray Dog Survey, again an investment by a UK charity, this time the Dogs Trust, involving an annual survey of all local authority facilities that handle stray dogs in the UK, providing an ongoing measure of several indicators of stray dog handling and fate in the UK. And I think both these annual surveys have been really useful for planning future DPM interventions. So I'd now like to highlight some of the more recent tools used for DPM in the UK. In 2016, it became mandatory to microchip and register your dog. So the main purpose of this was to improve the speed and success of reuniting lost dogs with their owners. Many of those 81,000 dogs collected from UK streets in 2016 are lost as opposed to abandoned, and the owners do want them back. And it's estimated that just over half of those dogs are reunited relatively quickly. We also have campaigns targeting the issue of the illegal import of puppies, an issue which seems to be increasing over the last few years. We have a relatively new tool called the PAPI Contract, and that's aiming to improve acquisition of dogs. It includes a checklist of questions for both buyer and breeder, plus a formal contract. The concept is that those questions ensure that the buyer has thought in depth about whether getting a puppy is right for them, and the breeder is encouraged to act responsibly, because these are quite searching questions about their behaviour and provisioning for puppies and parents. We've also seen the veterinary community come together to challenge the breeding of dogs with inherent welfare problems, most notably the brachycephalic dogs. And it's really good to see this professional community act with such a coordinated and strong voice for dog welfare. And finally, DEFRA, which is the government department responsible for DPN, are starting to review legislation relating to breeders and vendors. And there is maybe the potential for them to ban certain breeds on the basis of welfare. They could indeed also look to increase the import age of dogs to 6 months following Brexit. None of that's confirmed at this time, but those are a couple of options that are on the table for discussion at the moment. Okay, we're now looking at a very different situation in Kathmandu in Nepal, so that's the capital city of Nepal. So through a process of combining street surveys with household questionnaires, we found that 30% of the households within this capital city owned dogs, which is quite high considering it's an urban area. We found that 53% of those owned dogs were allowed to roam freely for at least part of the day. And we found that just 20% of the female dogs were sterilised. So we know we have high dog ownership, a lot of roaming, and many of those roaming dogs are unsterilised. We also asked that question about whether you knew of puppies that had been born in your immediate neighbourhood in the last 12 months, similar to what we did in Trebonnier. And of the people that did know of a litter, 83% knew that at least one of the puppies within that litter had been abandoned in the last year. So we know that abandonment of unwanted puppies is common and therefore a significant source of roaming dogs. We found that 40% of people feed street dogs, so that's feeding them at least once a week. So the community dogs have the potential to breed because they are provided with resources on a regular basis. We found 9% of the street dog population was lactating. which shows that they are breeding at least relatively successful, although that doesn't make comment on the process of recruitment of the survival of those puppies that are born. And we found that 19% of the females were spayed, which is a good finding, but there have been previous DPM efforts, and so there's a foundation to build upon. So based on the insights provided by that initial assessment, a new DPM intervention was launched called Mitra, meaning friend of human. And it has quite a localised and an empowering management structure. There are 32 wards in Kathmandu, and the plan is that each one will have its own animal management unit. That would include a community coordinator, animal handlers, and many volunteer members. Now, in this photo, we have a community coordinator talking to a group of community health volunteers. So this is another project entirely, which is focused on child and family health, such as making sure that children get their polio vaccinations. So Mitra piggybacks on this already existing community network to disseminate messages about rabies vaccination and the availability and importance of dog sterilisation. These animal management units also undertake participatory research within their own ward, and these build on the insights drawn from that initial Kathmandu-wide baseline initial assessment, and it also then builds the capacity of the ward-based unit and the ownership over their data so that then they can track their own progress over time. Then there is a phase of community sensitisation to build motivation and interest in the vaccination, sterilisation of dogs. Now again, the animal management unit decides how best to do this for their ward. And in this photo here, what we see is a ward that chose to do a street march as a form of dissemination. And about 200 people took part in the march from a ward of just 8,000, which shows how high up the agenda this dog issue is. This other photo is from the school education programme, which focuses on bite prevention and treatment. They also run dog health camps, providing sterilisation and vaccination for owned dogs. This photo shows one set up outside a temple on a Saturday when fewer people are at work and so are more able to bring their dogs. They also sterilise and vaccinate community dogs with full community involvement in both. Okay, so what I've presented here is this process of a kind of evidence-based DPM, starting with identifying priority problems so that you have clearly stated goals that everybody agrees on from the outset. Then initial assessment to expose states and processes of dog population dynamics. We know that DPM is not a one-size-fits-all situation. You need to create the intervention that suits your local dog population. The intervention should be designed to target the source of the roaming dogs, so you're working on both the cause and also the symptom of the current roaming dog population. All activities involved must respect animal welfare. This DPM needs to be ethical and humane. You're not going to manage to engage many members of the community unless it is that. You need to monitor indicators and give yourself the time and brain space to evaluate the data from that monitoring process and adaptively manage the intervention. DPM is a permanent challenge and we need to be able to improve and evolve what we're doing over time. And then we have that question, who drives this? Who drives this process? And this is where HCD, or Humane Community Development, steps in, using the power of that multi-stakeholder community group and the intelligence of that multi-stakeholder group to drive this process for best success. So I hope you found this presentation helpful. I've just listed a few resources up here. You can go to the ICANN website to find the Humane DPM Guide and also the document Are We Making a Difference, which is about monitoring and evaluation and has a lot more detail about some of those methods I described. You can go to the OIE, to the Terrestrial Animal Health Code, so Chapter 7.7, which is the Stray Dog Population Control Standard. And then there's also a Chapter 19 in the Domestic Dog is about dog population management. And that's a book edited by James Serpol. Okay, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much.